story that we've had on exhibit for a long time here is early dentistry. We've had an exhibit in the Sam Gym House honoring Sigrid Gimse. But as Sigrid Gimse is no longer with us, I did want to talk about early dentistry practices. And Anne Crowley has offered to come and talk to us about early dentistry, as well as her own experience working as a dentist in Pemberton since the early 70s.
All right, well, thank you very much for coming. I thought I would have as a theme today women in dentistry in Pemberton, because it began pretty much on a professional level with, as Nikki has alluded to, Sigrid Gimse. And has carried on through. I was the second dentist in Pemberton, and I've just recently sold my practice to, of course, another woman. So, so we're carrying on the tradition of female dentists in Pemberton. So I thought I would just speak a little bit about Sigrid, first of all. So Sigrid Gimse, she was born in Oslo, Norway, and she was the daughter herself of a dentist. And he was a practicing dentist and also a professor of dentistry at the university that she went to. So perhaps she was inspired to become a dentist through her father. She married Carl Gimse. He was a lawyer in 1907. And they had a very substantial home and not far off Oslo. And he had his office in the home and she had her office in the home. And they both practiced out of there. In 1923, however, 16 years after they were married and they had 2 children at this time, their house burned to the ground, so it was quite a tragedy. And they did rebuild, but it was very expensive, and her husband Carl had become involved in real estate, and then there was an economic downturn in Norway, and so things conspired. I think their fate, I think, began to go downhill, so they decided to immigrate to Canada. And so Carl left, and he arrived here, I believe, moved directly to the Pemberton Valley, as far as I know, which is very strange, but all the way from Norway. So that was in 1927, and Sigrid and her daughter followed in 1929. Sigrid did bring her chair and most of her tools. We didn't know that at first, but I found that out through some family records. Because as a dentist, thinking back then and how difficult it was to get to Pemberton, you wonder how would she have obtained the tools and the chair and then got them here, and so on and so on. So she did bring many of her own tools here. So they first lived on the Fowler farm. I don't know if any of you know where that is, but it's up quite a ways up the valley, up by the Rosses. And they a little later moved down to the Barber property, which is where Nick Antonelli lives now, about a mile away from Pemberton. So Maureen McCormick is one of her granddaughters, and she remembers that a trip to Grandma was often a trip to the dental chair. So that's the way things go. Now, I understand from the family that when they were in the Barber house, floods were very common in Pemberton. That's sort of the history here. And I guess Carl just had it with one too many floods, and he said, that's it, we're out of here. And they moved to Birken. And that was in 1942. So that would be, 10, what would that be? About 15 years later almost, yeah. So another woman who I talked to was the name of Teresa Summerskill. And that's her married name, but her parents were both Norwegian. So she became a friend of the family's. And Teresa has some, Teresa's in her, I think probably in her early 90s now. She lives down in Squamish. And Teresa remembers, her very well. And she remembers that she took her to Lillooet with her one time as her assistant. And Teresa says she doesn't really know why. Dentists in those days didn't have an assistant, but for some reason I guess she thought she might need some help with recording or something. So they went to Lillooet, where she examined a lot of school children. And while she was there, a young woman approached her and asked about could she get her teeth fixed. And she said, well, certainly, but I'm leaving now, so why don't you come down to Birken and we'll arrange for you to have your teeth fixed. So there was a train at that time, so she came down on the train down to Birken, and she was met at the train station by Sigrid's son, Gunnar, who apparently was a very handsome young man, and quite the character, and he had a sports car. So she was just totally overwhelmed by this, and they went on to marry. So she had her teeth fixed that weekend and hiked the glaciers and just had a wonderful time. So that was where the Gimse family comes from. From there, Sigrid continued to practice dentistry in Birken. Bob Menzel, who spoke last week, remembers actually going to Birken to have a tooth fixed, probably on an emergency sort of a basis. But by this time in the 40s, Sigrid was suffering from a lot of facial pain, and she had a significant hearing loss. And so this has been described to me a few times over the last 30 years, you know, as I knew that there was this other woman dentist there. And I've gradually become sort of aware that the symptoms that she described, where it was this debilitating pain, it's a pain that is unbelievable, and it typically radiates down the jaws, and it can be triggered by a breath of air or, you know, anything sort of like a feather touch, anything. And this condition that she suffered from was probably a condition we call tic de la Rue or trigeminal neuralgia. And it's an irritation of one of the ganglions in the central nervous system that's in the brain, right in here. And it controls all the sensation in your face. So that's the nerve that the dentist freezes if we want to fix your teeth. So we would freeze either the first division, the second division, or the third division. But when this ganglion inside your brain becomes irritated, it causes the most intense pain imaginable. Anybody who's had a toothache, you know, multiply that by 20, 30 times, and this unrelenting pain, and people who suffer from this condition are often suicidal, and they just can't bear the pain. Today we have some drugs that deal with it, but back in those days, the only thing that you could do was to go through the skull and cut the ganglion. So I guess it got to be so bad that she did go down to Squamish, and a physician down there attempted the operation. It didn't work very well, and she ended up not a lot better, but with total hearing loss at that point, and she could barely stand because she had lost her balance. You know, unfortunately, her later years she was in a lot of pain. She relied on her family totally, and then she gradually, you know, went downhill, and she died in 1959. So from there on, there was really no dentist in Pemberton until 1965, when of course the road came in, because there was really no way for, even if there was a dentist, for the dentist to get here unless they took the train. So in 1965, a program was already in effect through the public health government of BC, where dentistry was a much needed commodity back then. There was dentists in Vancouver, dentists in Victoria, but apart from that, there probably weren't very many dentists anywhere else in the province. So they began a program to try to encourage young dentists to move to rural areas. So they had mobile equipment. Young dentists would sign up out of university, and they would travel for a year, coming to different places. So from 1965 on, Pemberton usually had a visiting dentist every year. And the dentist would stay for a couple of months, and residents would know the dentist was coming. And so then they would make those appointments and have their family's dentistry done, and whatever else needs that they had. So that was that. Now the other way to get dentistry done between when Sigrid was practicing in the 40s and then in 65 would have been to go to Vancouver. So I've been Molly Ronan's dentist for many years, and Molly's told me some really great stories of, you know, having to go to the dentist and how she would get down to Vancouver. So at that time she would take the train from Pemberton, and then she would have to get a boat from Squamish and go to Vancouver. So, you know, it was quite the thing, you know, to have to do this, and imagine, you know, the expense and everything. But apart from that, Molly would tell me that, you know, going to the dentist was really something the whole family looked forward to, because it meant a trip to the city, a stay in the Alcazar Hotel, $2 a night. And I don't know if any of you remember the Alcazar Hotel, but I certainly remember it growing up in Vancouver. It was quite the seedy hotel by that time, but you know, when she was going, it would have been one of the, you know, better hotels in Vancouver. And she says, and they went to a movie, always went to a movie when they were down in Vancouver. And she said, and one of the other best things she said is she actually got to go shopping and try something on and see what it looked like, because of course everything was mail order or, you know, catalog or anything like that. So it's kind of interesting, you know, listening to stories about dentistry, you also get a feeling for other parts of life in Pemberton. And then I said to Molly, I said, well, how did you make the appointment? So, you know, because of course, being a dentist, you can't just sort of, well, people did arrive, and they still do today arrive, but it throws your schedule way off, you know. So she said at that time there was a train, the train station, and there was a telephone there. So that was made available for public to phone and make appointments and that sort of thing. But she said she often wrote. She wrote a letter to make an appointment, and that seems so crazy to me now in our modern day of, you know, computers. Like, we get annoyed if you know, we can't Google something in 20 seconds. Well, you know, you had to write to make an appointment, and I found that very, very interesting. She went to this one dentist. She'd been recommended to a dentist, and so she arrived there, and because I asked her, I said, well, how did you know who to go to, you know? And she said, well, you know, sometimes people would say, well, go to this dentist or whatever. So she went to this dentist, and he clearly had been drinking quite a lot. And it turns out, you know, Molly just said, no, I'm not gonna see you. But it turned out that he had the same name as the other dentist that she'd been referred to. So, but she's quite the storyteller, as many of you probably know. You know, that sort of tied into this need where, you know, people obviously couldn't do that. And if you wanted to go to Squamish, eventually there was a dentist in Squamish. But if you wanted to go to Squamish, I mean, you would wait literally months to get an appointment. You know, it would be the waiting list. Even when I started practicing dentistry in 1977 in rural areas in British Columbia, it was not uncommon to have an appointment 3 months down the road. Yeah, so, you know, imagine. I mean, I feel badly if I can't get a patient in the next day. Yeah, it would be, you know, a huge waiting list if the dentist would take the patients at that point. So this is sort of where my story in dentistry comes in. So, as Nikki said, I went to UBC. I had traveled. I'd gone through high school in West Vancouver. It was expected of me, because I was a very academic child, and it was expected of me that I would go to university at the time. Went to university, and I was extremely disappointed. I was ready for some academic experience, and it just was more of the same, it seemed. So I said, heck with this, and I went and traveled around the world for about 1.5 years, and I mostly traveled through India and Sri Lanka and Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq and all these places. And so that was in the days of, you know, I was a 60s child, so I was in the days of the hippies. So I was convinced, as all my generation were, that I had to do my part to save the world. So I got into knowing quite a few people with QSO. I don't know if anybody remember QSO, but that was an organization that was going to try to bring Western science to make the world a better place. So I came back motivated to go into agriculture, because I thought I could, you know, do that, and I wanted to become a veterinarian. So I was in agriculture at UBC, and I was going to become a veterinarian. My uncle is a veterinarian, and but things started to happen. I was starting to get sick, which wasn't like me. Turns out I was allergic to hay, animals, all this sort of thing to deal with. And at that time, for a woman to get into a veterinarian school was, they just told me outright. They didn't even look at my thing. They said, you know, we're not even going to consider you. So I sort of thought, oh God, now I was so sure what I wanted to do, and now what am I going to do? So just on a whim, I applied to the dental school at UBC. I really didn't know anything about dentistry. I really didn't even give it too much thought. I just applied. It was just a whim, really. And I got a phone call, and I'd been accepted. I remember saying to my mother, oh my God, I've got accepted. What do I do now? So she said, well, you know, you can always quit. I said, yeah, that's true, I can. So, but it was very strange, because I didn't have an interview, because it was very difficult to get into dentistry like it is to get into medical school. I didn't have an interview, nothing, they just accepted me. So, I don't know what happened. But it turns out I got into my studies, I loved it. I thought this was just a lucky chance. I love this career, and so I went forward from there. I was the president of the UBC Dental Undergraduate Society. So one of my jobs as the president of a society was to make opportunities available to my fellow classmates. So I had heard about this public health program where the government would make available this mobile equipment for young dentists to travel to remote areas of British Columbia and provide services. So I thought, well, that would be good. The interesting thing was the head of public health at that point was a Oregon grad, and up until this time, all the traveling dentists were either Oregon grads or Loma Linda grads. And there'd never been a UBC graduate going, and I thought, what a shame. We should be getting our UBC graduates to be going out into the wilds of BC. So I made this proposition available to the rest of my students, and they and so we had, I think, 6 people from my class that were interested in doing it. So we applied, and I thought, well, you know, I was, I think, the 3rd top student in my class that year, and I was president of the undergraduate society, and I had this and that, and I thought, oh, I'll get the opportunity to do this. Well, lo and behold, I was not given the opportunity to do this, and all my classmates were given postings, but I wasn't. So I was really perturbed about this. So I inquired. I said, why wasn't I given a job? They said, well, you know, you're a woman, and you won't be able to fix the equipment, and you won't be able to, you know, endure the hardships. And I said, oh, you just said that to the wrong person. So anyways, I said, well, you know, I think that the Sun newspaper will be very interested in this story. How you've been giving these jobs to American graduates, and you're not going to give this job to me, you know? So they said, well, wait a second, maybe we could find you some equipment. So they did. They found me some equipment and gave me a posting. Now the equipment that they found me was this derelict old piece of equipment that they had posted down to the basement and they were going to dispose of. So this is the equipment they give me, this woman who can't fix anything, right? So sent me to Hornby Island. And again, this was the end of the 60s, and Hornby Island was a land of hippies and communes in those days. But it was a great place for me to start practicing. From Hornby Island, I went to Gold River and stayed there for 8 months, and then from Gold River I came to Pemberton. And every community you came to, of course, people were very glad to see you. They were, you know, always waiting for you. And the nurse usually, the nurse at that time here in Pemberton was a woman by the name of Mary Taves, and she set everything up for me, found me a place to rent. I had my mobile unit was hooked up beside the health center where the doctor's offices are right now, and so I operated out of there. And so I stayed here for 4 months, and then everywhere you went, people would say, please come back and set a practice up. But at that time, I wasn't really ready to settle down. I didn't have any money, for one thing. And I said, well, you know, I'll think about it. But Mary, the nurse administrator there, was just relentless. She just phoned me and wrote me and phoned me. And like, we've got a space for you. We can find a space and da-da-da-da. So I said, well, you know, let me think about it. So in the meantime, I'd taken a job with the federal government this time. And I worked out of Prince Rupert, and I used to visit remote communities on the northwest coast of British Columbia. So I'd go to the Charlottes, I'd go up to Telegraph Creek, go to Iskut, Greenville, New Ianche, and places like this, and fly into little coastal communities like Kitwanga and those areas. So after that year, I began to think of Pemberton, and it's like, well, you know, maybe I'll take Mary up on my on her offer, and you know, and by that time I had a little bit of savings put away, and so I said, yeah, I'll come back to Pemberton, and it's a decision I've never regretted ever since. It all sort of transpired to be, you know, to really work, because when I first came to Pemberton, you know, there was a great need for dentistry in the community. But there was a huge need for dentistry in Mount Currie. The dental health was extremely poor, and you know, my work was cut out for me doing a lot of really heroic dentistry. So, but it was really good because that year of working for the federal government, where I had learned a lot about First Nations culture, you know, allowed me to feel much more comfortable working in a community with 2 cultures. When I first came to Pemberton, it was great because I could go off in the winter for a month and take a month's holiday, and nobody cared. because God, they never had a dentist before. So like, you know, today if I take a week off, it's like, what do you know, I don't know, right? But you know, in those days, I'm like, I'm gone for a month. Okay, no problem. All right, good. So one of our trips is we went down to New Zealand and camped around New Zealand for a month. And while I was down in New Zealand, it was interesting. New Zealand has public type dentistry where they provide free dentistry to children till they're 21, I think. So, and at that time, New Zealand was a very, very, very rural area. There was only one city, but most people lived in the rural areas. And it seemed like everywhere we went, there was a little house, a little building with the dentist in there. And I thought, that would be great. I'm going to come back to Pemberton because I was in this modular building and I wanted my own space and I wanted my own practice. But at that time there was no commercial space in Pemberton and I wasn't about to build a commercial building. But there were some commercially available houses and lots around. So I bought the house that I have as my office now beside the RCMP. And my father and friends and local people helped me to tear it apart and build my office. And the same year that I finished building my new practice, I gave birth to my first son, Jerry. And luckily at this time, my brother Steve, who was my first assistant, had just finished dental school. And so I said, great, how would you like to come to Pemberton and be my locum while I look after my new baby? So he did, and he loved Pemberton. He really was torn, he really thought about settling here, but his dream as he'd gone through school was to become an oral surgeon. So he stayed with me for a year, and then he went back to school and did his specialty down in the United States, and now he's an oral surgeon in Nanaimo. So then, and then about a short year later, after my son was born, Jerry, my daughter arrived, Jillian, and so I was a busy girl in those days. I was running a busy practice, and I had, you know, 2 children, and it was some busy days. You know, you look back and wonder how you did that. In my story here, I have had many associate dentists come and join me because as Pemberton grew, and my practice grew. Because in those days too, there was no dentist in Whistler. So as Whistler grew, I was the only dentist, you know, north of Squamish. And so I had a huge Whistler practice, and I still have a substantial Whistler practice actually. And so I had patients coming from Whistler, from Pemberton, from Darcy, from Birkin, and even I still have some patients coming down from the Yallecum Valley up in Lillooet, and even some Lillooet patients actually come and see me as well. So I needed help many times, and so I would have an associate that would come and work for me. Unfortunately, these associates only lasted for 1 to 2 years. And then I think every one of my associates but one went on to become a specialist. So that was always, it was a help, but then when they left, it was always, oh my God, now I got to work really hard again. This is a power drill, and I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember that those things were brutal. There was a pulley that used to go around and drive the slow speed drill, and you know, there was usually smoke coming out the other end of that drill. I just thank God I'm a dentist in my era and not in those old eras, because it must have been terrible, you know. And you know, there was a huge, when I first got into dentistry, there was this new generation of young dentists practicing a new sort of modern dentistry, but there was many of the older dentists around, and so some of the problems that we knew were around was a very high alcoholism rate in dentistry, because it was such a horrendous job. You know, I mean, you didn't have good equipment, you didn't have good anesthesia. So there's some interesting tools, and I'm sure some of them just evoke fear. They evoke fear in me even, you know, when I look at some of these things. And so, you know, dentistry has come, you know, a really long way. There's actually a can of ether here.
Did you have to sharpen your own needles?
I never did, no, thank God. And that's another, you know, huge thing that has made dentistry, you know, comfortable, is the fact that, yeah, the needles are ultra sharp now, and you dispose of them. But yeah, I mean, in the old days, she would have had some needles that she would have put in some kind of blue bath to kind of try to sterilize them, God, you know, and she would have had to actually hand sharpen them. So imagine the bore of those needles.
So when would
people have started doing root canals and things like that.
He was the first endodontist in Vancouver, and I think he did his first root canal in, I think, about 1925, and there was barely x-rays in those days.
In 1945, I had a root canal, my first one.
Did you?
And just a local dentist.
Yeah.
And he put some poison of some sort in to kill the nerve.
Yeah.
And said, 3-4 days, and he'll be dead. We can
Yeah.
do something, you see. But for some reason, he had me back in 1 or 2 days later. Until I think it's done enough.
It wasn't.
And it wasn't. I thought those needles were right out the top of my head. And he worked away at it for a long time. He finally said, this isn't going to work. And he pulled it out.
Did he? Oh, God.
Oh.
So I was driving my father's motorcycle with a sidecar at 16. So I went down and I sat on that motorcycle for about 15 minutes before I had even tried to drive. I'd never forget that.
Oh, my God.
Dr. Thompson, I never forget him.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and we really appreciate the history of Mrs. Gimse.
Yeah.
That's just fantastic.